It's my great pleasure to welcome you, Professor Sean Latham from University of Tulsa. Sean Latham is a Walter Professor of English and a director of the Tulsa Institute for Bob Dylan Studies. He has also served as the director of the Oklahoma Center for Humanities, and currently he's working on a book that explores Dylan's creative life. Sean Latham's research focus on modern literature and culture, with a particular focus on major figures like James Joyce and Bob Dylan. He's the author or editor of several books that explore topics like snobbery, genre fiction, and modernism. One of his most important publications is a monograph, The Art of Scandal, Modernism, Libel Law, and the Roman à clef. And he's the editor of the James Joyce Quarterly, the very important journal, James Joyce Quarterly. And last year he organized the World of Bob Dylan, the conference that was the first conference of the Bob Dylan Institute in Tulsa. It was a very well organized conference, I should say, and it was highly praised by all participants who came from so many different countries. And next year, when Bob Dylan turns 80, Sean will publish a volume from the conference at the Cambridge University Press, and I look so much forward to this volume. Sean Latham visited SDU in 2018 and participated in our Bob Dylan conference. And I'm very happy today to welcome several of the participants of the conference today. It's so good to have you back here, although this is a digital meeting. Still, we know you are there, and it's a great feeling to have you back. Our conference volume has just been published, and this includes an excellent essay of Sean on Bob Dylan in youth magazines of the 60s. Today his topic is From New Orleans to Jerusalem, Bob Dylan's Restless Farewell. I warmly welcome Professor Sean Latham.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm just gonna tinker here just a little bit to share my screen and get this set up. So I hope you'll bear with me for just a moment. We did a tech check the other day and it worked then, so we'll see if it works now. All right, there we go. All right, I hope you can all see my slides and hear me, and we'll cross our fingers that when I get to the audio portion that this works as well. This is always a bit of a challenge with these. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Anne-Marie for the invitation to come and attend, and I certainly I'm grateful to Diaz as well for making this opportunity available and for having a chance to share some of my work on Dylan with you. I was actually scheduled to be at SDU maybe a month ago or something like that. I don't even quite remember now. Time has lost all meaning as we've started working from home. But I regret that I can't be there with you in person. Obviously, the COVID crisis and thing has made that very difficult at the moment. But I'm delighted that we were able to still do the talk this way, and that I could meet with you digitally and share some of the work that I've been doing on Dylan. You'll see I've got a slightly different title for the talk here, Bob Dylan at War. This is a version actually of a talk, strangely enough, that I was asked to give at the United States Air Force Academy, one of our military academies here in the United States, on Dylan and aspects of war, and that was the sort of genesis of this talk. I've adapted it slightly for today's purposes, but it did take shape in me trying to think, what do future military officers need to know about Bob Dylan? And I spoke maybe to 150 cadets, maybe more, when I first gave this talk, and they were none of them really knew who Bob Dylan was, but they all came away really interested by Dylan. So I hope you find this talk interesting as well. So, sorry, this is something that's going on my computer here. Okay, when Ken Burns released his 2017 documentary on the Vietnam War, it included a soundtrack with several songs that registered the conflict, confusion, division, and anger of that era. It included everything from pacifist laments like Buffalo Springfield's Ohio, to Barry McGuire's rumbling Eve of Destruction, and Merle Haggard's conservative anthem, Okie from Muskogee. And for those who don't know any of these songs, I'm just going to play just a tiny bit of Eve of Destruction from Barry McGuire here, one of the iconic songs from that era. Sorry, I tried to close the ad, didn't work. Rain's Gonna Fall, his 1963 masterpiece, opens the film amidst a long montage of scenes mixing combat abroad and protests at home. And I'll play just a little, or I'll play this in just a moment. So this is Dylan's performance of the song. The song itself is based on an old Scottish folk tune called, it's got a lot of names, but it's most commonly called Lord Randall's Lament. And that ancient ballad is narrated by a young lord whose lover poisoned him. He returns to his family's home in order to explain what has happened to his mother, slowly relating the haunting tale of his death as he literally dies in front of her eyes and indeed inside of our ears. Now, in Dylan's reworking of this song, the young aristocrat is replaced by a blue-eyed son who has wandered out into the world and witnessed a series of horrors that he can barely describe to his mystified and terrified mother. And I'll play now just the first verse of this long song.
Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son? And where have you been, my darling young one? I stumbled on the sides of 12 misty mountains. I'm walking and crawling 6 crooked highways. I've stepped in the middle of 7 sad forests. I've been out in front of a dozen dead oceans. I've been 10,000 miles in the mouth of a graveyard. And it's hard, and it's hard, and it's hard, and it's hard, and it's a hard rains are gonna fall.
So one of the things that makes Dylan's versions of this song so different than the source material that he uses is that the song itself is not a tragedy. Dylan is not describing the death of the blue-eyed son. Instead, it ends with that young character promising to go back out again after relating all of the horrors, everything he's seen and felt and heard in a world that's clearly wrenched with confusion. He decides at the very end of the song to go back out and try to describe what he has experienced, to pay some kind of witness. And he promises he will learn his song well before he starts singing. And some of you, of course, may recognize this as the song that Patti Smith performed at the Nobel acceptance ceremony, which Dylan did not attend, but Patti Smith gave a fantastic rendition of this song. As a poem and as a song, I think it's a brilliant metaphor for the alienation of youth, for the gaps that inevitably emerge between parents and children, and for the process of poetic invention that struggles to transform the mystery of experience into something that can be real and shared. But what in the world does it have to do with the Vietnam War? When it was written in 1963, few Americans knew or cared much about what appeared to be a low-level conflict on the other side of the globe. I'm relatively certain that Dylan himself couldn't have picked out Vietnam on a map, and the cover of the album on which this song appears, improbably titled The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, does not suggest any kind of anti-war protest. It's him and his girlfriend famously walking down a street in Greenwich Village. So why did Ken Burns use this song to start his documentary? Indeed, why are there more songs on that documentary by Dylan than anyone else? One answer, of course, is that Dylan is the so-called voice of his generation, or the conscience of the 1960s, both titles that he has scornfully rejected. His fans unquestionably fell almost entirely to the political left in the 1960s and 70s, and leaders of various activist groups tried to claim his image, his sound, and his fame for their own ends. In some of these cases, Dylan eagerly contributed his voice, performing, for example, on the National Mall just before Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. And that picture in the middle of the screen here is Dylan at that march with his guitar case. And I should say that amid a new wave of civil rights protests here in the United States and around the world, it's useful to remember that the pursuit of racial equity and justice is probably one of the most consistent political ideals that we can attribute unhesitatingly to Dylan. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Now, in other cases in the 1960s, Dylan appears to have played along gamely with the politicization of his music for his own ends, perhaps, as when Pete Seeger and Joan Baez actively recruited him to join the folk movement and covered his songs at labor and peace rallies. More troublingly, the radical anarchist group called Weather Underground took their name from a Dylan lyric as they launched a national campaign of bombing, arson, and robbery. We thus shouldn't be surprised that by the late 1960s, Dylan had largely isolated himself, both personally and musically. At the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, I've got a picture of it here on the screen, Dylan infamously seemed to turn his back on folk music in its entirety when he showed up in Ray-Bans and a leather jacket, then plugged in that electric guitar that he's holding. Fans booed, critics raged in little magazines, and there's even an apocryphal story of a distraught Seeger running around backstage with an axe trying to cut power to the amps, while his father wept over the perceived end of the folk movement in a pickup truck. We don't think any of these stories are actually true, but in some sense they became integral to the Dylan myth, that this was this moment of fundamental rupture with the folk movement. In a burst of creativity, Dylan then released 3 albums of screaming rockers that were unlike most music that he had made before, and then withdrew almost entirely to the artist colony of Woodstock, New York, after a motorcycle accident nearly took his life. The 1969 Woodstock Festival, and I've got the famous poster here, those days of peace and love that were offered as a protest to the Vietnam War, did not actually take place in Woodstock, New York. Instead, they took place in Bethel, a town about an hour away, a little bit longer than that by car. The organizers used the name Woodstock in part because they hoped Dylan would participate, that by pitching this thing in his backyard, Dylan would come out and perform, but he did not. Instead, Dylan left the country after giving an interview in which an old friend from the folk movement asked him about the war. After dancing around the question and trying not to answer it, a hostile Dylan wrapped things up by saying, "How do you know I'm not for the war?" How indeed, actually. The word Vietnam does not appear in any of the 359 original songs he has recorded. At the start of his career, he did record a couple of songs that are generally about the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. But on the question of Vietnam, the so-called voice of his generation is completely silent. There is, in other words, something odd about a director like Ken Burns slipping Dylan into his documentary, trying to make the lyrics say something about which their author remains stubbornly silent. Now, this is not to say that Dylan doesn't write about war. In his 2004 memoir, Chronicles, Volume 1, leaving us hoping that there might be a Volume 2, one of the most now long fabled promises in the Dylan world. He writes that while everyone else was wondering and worrying about Vietnam, he spent his evenings in the New York Public Library. Here's what he says. I started reading newspapers on microfilm from 1855 to about 1865. Those are the years leading up to and including the American Civil War, to see what daily life was like. It wasn't like it was another world, but the same one, only with more urgency. You get the feeling that the newspapers themselves could explode and lightning will burn and everybody will perish. Back there, he concludes, America was put on the cross, died, and was resurrected. The god-awful truth of that would be the all-encompassing template behind everything that I would write. And write, he did. Some of Dylan's greatest war songs, it turns out, are not about Vietnam, but about the American Civil War, and about the ways in which the violence of American history is woven through the fabric of the nation's lofty ideals. Thus can the 60s generation hear Vietnam when he releases a song called Masters of War. And a later generation, in fact, my generation, can hear something else. We can hear the fury and confusion of the first Gulf War. When he covers that song again, just on the verge of that war at the 1991 Grammy Awards, its lyrics and that song itself now transformed amid a screaming band caught somewhere between punk and grunge. And I'll play just a bit of a clip from that. And as I do, I should say, this is one of Dylan's stranger performances. He's there to receive an award. He appears to be heavily intoxicated on stage. And I'm going to skip over the first minute and half of this song because Dylan comes out on stage and won't perform. The band is playing and they keep playing the same chords over and over again, waiting for Dylan to start the song. And he futzes around with his microphone and then his harmonica, and he talks to somebody. And it's clear he won't start the song, and then he just rips into it. So I'll play just a little bit of that futzing around here. It's almost Chaplin-like. And then you'll see he just jumps straight into the song. And it's this piece, just keep playing over and over again, waiting for him to come to the microphone. Nothing seems to be working quite right. And you can hear how muddied these lyrics are, how different they are than what we heard earlier. As I said, the song is basically sunk down into a kind of combination of punk and grunge. And even the audience took a long time to realize Dylan was actually performing Masters of War at that year's Grammys. So, and this ability of Dylan to create these war songs and to grapple with the problem of violence, we hear not only in a performance like this, but probably, indeed, impossibly, we hear a similar anguish around the attack on the Twin Towers in Love and Theft, that album which, amazingly enough, arrived in stores on the morning of September 11th, 2001. And for some Dylanologists of a certain age, their memories of that morning are mixed with going out to buy this album as record stores opened that morning and learning of the news of the attacks on New York and Washington. The album's opening track features Tweedledee and Tweedledum, two warring brothers who are a metaphor for a riven America, and it's followed by the song High Water Everywhere, which describes a national disaster. It's bad out there, Dylan concludes, then invokes the biblical flood. There's high water everywhere. In his fascination with the Civil War and his belief that it remains a kind of master template for American history and identity, Dylan, I want to argue, becomes one of our great modern war poets. That is, he's less the Vietnam protest singer that Ken Burns wants him to be, than a kind of musical philosopher who struggles to deal with the ethical, moral, and aesthetic paradoxes of violence as a fundamental part of American idealism. In the balance of this talk, I want to argue that Dylan devotes a significant part of his later career, in particular, to the problem of the past. The greatest challenge we face, his work seems to argue, is learning to live with the ghosts that we have created. These are the shadows not only of our past selves, but the revenants of a national history that shapes and confines us in various ways. Americans have a tendency to see ourselves as magically set free from history. A nation where you are not defined by your family, your father, your religion, or your class. This is, I think, actually integral to the early Dylan, who was famously born Robert Zimmerman, changed his name, changed his whole backstory when he came to New York. And in a song like Lo and Behold, which we hear on the Basement tapes, it's actually built around this idea of that American myth of just setting out and transforming yourself utterly. The main character in that song sets out on this kind of hobo's quest only to be asked his name and to accidentally give his own name and suddenly feel crushed that he can't actually get away in the way that he thought he could. Now, we know that this is little more than a myth, but it's a powerful story nevertheless. Powerful enough that it takes the protests we now see to insist that history cannot be so easily escaped. That myth is particularly difficult to reconcile with the knowledge of the past we do carry with us. The violence of chattel slavery in the United States that built our national wealth, and the legacy of colonial expansion that wrested the land where I'm now speaking to you from the peoples of the Muskogee Creek and Cheyenne Arapaho tribes. It's there in those Civil War newspapers Dylan read in New York, which reminded him that the idea of a single national identity is just that, an idea regularly given the lie by violence, racism, sexism. We have a past, Dylan reminds us, and a moral obligation to wrestle with all its nastiness and terror. To make this argument, I want to look at three key songs from Dylan's long recording career that tell us a story of his attempt to make sense of the past. They'll carry us, as we'll see, from a kind of youthful rebellion born of idealism through a direct confrontation with the brute fact of slavery, and finally toward a reckoning in which Dylan commits to wrestling again and again with his own strong spirits from the past. So when Dylan reached New York in 1961, he was already a young man possessed, walking, talking, and singing like Woody Guthrie, a revenant from another world. He had even half invented a fake history for himself by lifting little bits and pieces from the pages of Bound for Glory, Woody Guthrie's own semi-fictional account of his life in the Dust Bowl. And if you don't know this part of Dylan's story, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, he literally does change his name, tell all kinds of stories about his past. He worked in a carnival, and that's where he learned how to sing songs, and he learned how to play the guitar from an old black man on a corner of Chicago, and he'd run away from home dozens of times. None of this stuff was actually true, but he told these stories again and again. And many of these stories were borrowed from Woody Guthrie's autobiography, which itself is only about half autobiography. So we have a sort of fictional account of Woody Guthrie's life that's then refictionalized by Dylan himself. And Dylan himself has, of course, comes to New York in 1961 in part to seek out Woody Guthrie, his great hero. Not long after Dylan's arrival, however, it became clear that this was not just a youthful journey to freedom, but an Odyssean trip to the underworld. When he passed through the gates of Greystone Psychiatric Hospital to seek out Woody Guthrie, Dylan discovered a frail, thin man suffering from Huntington's chorea who was too palsied to talk or sing. The young man later claimed that there had been some spark of recognition, but if so, it would have been hard to discern. And Dylan was haunted enough by what he had seen to try and exorcise this ghost. His first original composition, Song to Woody in 1962, concludes with the desperate hope that he might escape such a world and such a fate, that he, as the song ends, as the song says in its final verses, would be spared this kind of hard traveling too. In Song for Woody, Dylan learned to live with the past so that it might possess but never overpower him. He then built an astonishing career around a relentless series of similar farewells, first to Woody Guthrie, then to his folk audience on that steamy Newport evening, later to rock fans in a Nashville studio, and then again to his devout Christian believers with an album called Infidels in 1983, and more recently, to the very idea of himself as a singer-songwriter after releasing 5 long LPs packed with crooning covers. Again and again, Dylan uses his albums to imagine and even enact the end of one musical world in order to make way for another. Some of his most astonishing albums, Highway 61 Revisited, John Wesley Harding, Blood on the Tracks, and Love and Theft might even be seen as murder ballads. That is, they don't contain murder ballads, but the albums themselves are murder ballads. Attempts to kill off a public persona that for Dylan had become burdensome and even dangerous. Such deaths, however, create entire musical and imaginative worlds that we critics, musicians, scholars, and fans continue to explore. Meanwhile, Dylan himself slips away, refusing once again to be entombed in vinyl. So the first of the three farewells that I want to look at here today is an integral part of Dylan's myth. In November 1963, just on the eve of his first major concert at Carnegie Hall, Newsweek magazine published a short 2-column note buried in its arts and culture section titled, "I Am My Words." You can see it here on the left side of the screen. Dylan, his manager, and his PR team at the time all expected this to be a major profile. On par with the recent Time profile of Joan Baez that occupied the cover, an interior photo spread, and a dozen pages of writing in the magazine. So this is almost a third, I think, of this single issue of Time is given over to Joan Baez, including this very strange painting of her that appeared on the cover. So this is what Dylan was expecting in Newsweek, and instead what he got was a short expose that in these few paragraphs deftly revealed the truth about his past, that he was a middle-class kid from Hibbing and not a latter-day hobo poet. More troublingly, it wrongly suggested that his landmark hit, Blowin' in the Wind, had been cribbed from a kid in New Jersey. And the confusion here comes from the fact that Dylan had already published the lyrics to that song, and this kid then was performing it in clubs in New Jersey, and thus some people thought he had actually created this song. Dylan himself was absolutely furious when this article appeared, and it became a kind of wound, one that still ached, as we'll see over 50 years later. When the Newsweek article appeared, an angry Dylan first refused to talk to the press at all, before beginning what became a lifelong attack on every erstwhile journalist or interviewer who tried to get a quote from him or gain some insight into his music. If you've never seen Dylan interviewed by a reporter or read an interview with Dylan, you should watch any single one. He just tortures the poor people that try to do this job. Shortly after the Carnegie Hall concert, Dylan went across town to Columbia's New York studios and added an additional track titled Restless Farewell to an album that otherwise contained his most politically activist songs, the kind of music that led Seeger to champion his work and that still make critics and historians alike insist that he's the voice of the 60s. Also derived from a Scottish folk tune, this last-minute edition aims directly at the folk world from which these songs grew, as well as at the many writers, critics, and editors who had sought to shape and therefore constrain him. His lyrics are soaked in the imagery of martyrdom, and by the song's end, he envisions himself facing what seems to be defeat. Jump to that slide here. This effect is heightened by the tune's derivation from a ballad tradition that romanticizes doomed rebellions. I'll make my stand, he proclaims at the end of the song, and remain as I am, and bid farewell, and not give a damn. This heroic declaration of independence, however, is complicated by the lines just before it. Plainly invoking the Newsweek article, he describes the dirt and dust of gossip that cover him, before imagining an arrow in flight. So I'll just read these here. And the dirt of gossip blows in my face, and the dust of rumors covers me. But if the arrow is straight and the point is slick, it can pierce through dust no matter how thick. So I'll make my stand and remain as I am and bid farewell and not give a damn. Crucially, I think, we cannot tell if Dylan himself has loosed this arrow. If so, then it becomes a metaphor for his art and the underlying truths that cannot be obscured by gossip or the press. Alternatively, or maybe simultaneously, Dylan imagines himself as the martyred Saint Sebastian, in which case that arrow is the truth about his own past, punching through the false stories and gossip he has spread in order to land fatally in his own breast. The restless farewell thus does not come from a troubadour heading out onto the road, as was the case in that original folk tune, but instead marks the death of the Guthrie-esque persona that Dylan had fashioned. This Dylan had to be killed in order to make way for a new one, created by an artist who has to learn first not to give a damn about the past. In addition to penning Restless Farewell, Dylan also added the ominously titled poem 11 Outlined Epitaphs to the album, heightening the sense that the song might be laying to rest some older version of himself. One of the sections directly invokes the Newsweek interview and the larger mechanisms of fame it represented to him. I don't like to be stuck in print, staring out at cavity minds who gobble chocolate candy bars, quite content and satisfied. He then adopts a clever rhetorical trick that he will return to consistently throughout his career, suggesting that what he sings only makes sense within the context of the performance itself, and thus he can't be held accountable for anything he says or performs outside of the concert hall. Reporters and fans, he writes, have no way of knowing that I expose myself every time I step on the stage. There is no deeper meaning behind the lyrics, these lines suggest, no other way of understanding the man or the music than in the moment of its singing. In performance, at least, the world of Bob Dylan shrinks for a moment to encompass only the singer and his audience. Such is the hope, anyway, but this is a strategy doomed to failure, since such ghosts cannot be so easily banished. The boos and slow claps that accompanied him during these years, first at Newport in 1964, and then on the infamous 1966 World Tour, all demanded that the Revenant return. This refusal to accept Dylan's farewell and the accompanying demand that he thus freeze his world in amber has plagued him throughout his career. And so he has to keep saying goodbye, keep trying to exorcise the spirits that might otherwise overwhelm him. His attempts to escape, however, are never fully successful. Like that American myth of self-invention that I talked about earlier, they're all based on the idea that he can simply say farewell and then turn away and create something else. But the past, as William Faulkner famously wrote, is never really past. Nowhere is the limitation of this myth more evident than in what might well be Dylan's greatest song. It's a piece written out of time and out of order. It was originally recorded in 1983 at a moment when the songwriter's career was beginning a steady decline. Album sales were dropping, and the once youthful icon of revolution, invention, and individualism seemed to be losing his way. After the release of Infidels in 1983, and running through the next decade or so, Dylan released 5 successive albums that just seemed boring, actually. He had become a middle-aged 60s rock star who was terrified of becoming Elvis, especially this version of Elvis, right? This is Elvis's last performance. That is a nostalgia act who got up in nightclubs every night to play 60s hits for aging baby boomers. He even played the role, ironically, of just such a performer in an absolutely terrible 1987 film called Hearts of Fire. By this point, even his Restless Farewells had themselves become just another act. And indeed, it's so easy to imagine, this is Elvis in Vegas here, it's so easy to imagine a sort of alternative universe in which Dylan has gone to Vegas, right? You can see the costume changes between the acts on stage as he starts off in jeans and a check shirt, switches into a leather jacket, right? Maybe then puts on the cowboy hat and the white face paint for the blood on the ears, or the blood on the track's ears, right? It's so easy to have seen Dylan slipping into this kind of terrible nightclub act that would have targeted a very particular group of affluent Americans. He did not want to go down this path. So in the midst of this creative crisis, he creates a masterpiece called Blind Willie Mctell. He recorded it for Infidels and then strangely, mystifyingly, set it aside for reasons we still don't understand. Mark Knopfler, who plays guitar on the track, supposedly told Dylan it was brilliant and had to be released, but the song went first on tape, then into the can, finally into a vault. It only appeared 8 years later on a bootleg album, and those who heard it were those 8 years later were astonished. Now, it's a long song, but I want to play the entire thing for you, or at least all of the the lyrical parts of the song. All right, there's a beautiful musical outro here, but we won't, excuse me, I won't play that just in the interest of time. So this is an extraordinary song for all kinds of reasons. For my purposes, we find Dylan turning back to war here once again. Not to an old Irish battle this time, right? We're not going back to that Irish and Scottish tradition of rebellion, but to the American Civil War. And we find a man overwhelmed by its legacy. And I have to say, for my part, as the Black Lives Matters movements have been relit here in the United States in the last 2 weeks or so, the song has felt ever more urgent and powerful to me, making these reflections ever more timely. The man in the title, Blind Willie Mctell, is one of the great inventors of the American blues form, the form around which Dylan has built nearly every song he has recorded. And Dylan seems here to discover, as if for the first time, that the blues emerges from a very particular time and place, from the legacy of American slavery and the failures of Reconstruction, which left most Black people living in poverty and the humiliation of Jim Crow. All of the brutality of American chattel slavery and its aftermath is jammed into this song. We hear it in the burning plantations and the cracking whips that stand out against the smell of magnolias. There's the ghost of the coffin ships bearing tortured Black bodies to this continent, and the rebel yell that still presides over chain gangs in the South. Some aspects of the blues as a form can be traced directly to those enslaved plantations. The repeated lines, the simple instrumentation, and the so-called floating lyrics that turn up in different songs all emerge from a largely illiterate people trying to preserve their experiences with little more than a voice and the simplest of instruments. And the strong rhythmic drive of the blues emerged in part from the swinging of hammers on chain gangs in places like Texas and Georgia, and especially the now legendary Parchment Farm. That's where people like Pete Seeger, and especially his father, went to collect old blues songs, recording them on devices that could barely fit in the trunk of a car. They then took them north, released them. They helped make famous people like Leadbelly, that's him playing with Woody Guthrie there on the bottom, even while they made Leadbelly essentially act as a servant in their home. They were heard not only by a young Bob Dylan, but by people like Eric Clapton, John Lennon, and Keith Richards, who transformed them into a whole new genre whose name, rock, only accidentally points to the origins in the voices of Black men who swung hammers to break up stone. So in this extraordinary song, Dylan takes full measure of the racism built into the very fabric of the music he makes. And he comes to realize that he has always been haunted by the ghosts of Black men. No youthful farewells can dismiss them, since they live in the arrangement of chords on his guitar and the very structure of the music he makes. Dylan's decision not to release Blind Willie Mctell for almost a decade remains something of a mystery. The powerful first line, "This land is condemned," and the closing lament of a dying man seeing only power and greed and corruptible seed suggests that the blue-eyed son of hard rain has now morphed from a prophet or a seer into the source character for Lord Randall. Like that poisoned aristocrat, all Dylan can do now is recount his inability to reconcile himself with a past of seemingly endless waste and destruction. And I think it's really interesting to pair these two songs as different versions. Hard Rain and Blind Willie Mctell as two different versions of a reworking of Lord Randall. So no wonder Dylan chose not to release it. The singer who once stood ready to say farewell to each iteration of himself, right, to engage in this act of American reinvention, now seems to realize that he might have to say goodbye to everything, that there is no living with this past. In 2012, Dylan released Tempest, his 35th studio album. And until recently, It was the last to contain original tracks. He's got a new album, as you might know, called Rough and Rowdy Ways, coming out later this month, and he's released a couple of songs from it already. Shortly after the release of that album, Dylan sat down for an interview with Rolling Stone's Michael Gilmore, who starts the conversation by trying to goad the singer into admitting that his fame essentially rests on those early albums from the 1960s. Clearly, these questions are just designed to get under Dylan's skin. And not surprisingly, Dylan reacts violently. He resorts first to his old claim that his words and songs have meaning only in the moment of utterance. When Gilmore presses him to at least explain what he meant when he told an audience, "It looks like things are going to change now," just after Barack Obama's election, Dylan insists that whatever was said, it was said for the people in the hall and only for that night. He seems, in other words, to be managing the ghosts of the past the way he did in 1963, by insisting that the old songs, indeed entire performances, die the moment the house lights come up. Near the end of the interview, however, things take a turn as one of Dylan's oldest ghosts suddenly rematerializes. Change the slide here. Gilmore asks about the humorous moment when a young New Jersey cop actually arrested Bob Dylan when he was out supposedly looking for Bruce Springsteen's house in the countryside in New Jersey, which is just the most wonderfully Dylan thing to go do. Like, he's dressed typically as he usually is, in jeans, cowboy boots, a hoodie, and he's just wandering around, and this cop picks him up, not knowing who he has in the back of his squad car. Dylan initially playfully relates the story, and the whole thing feels like a Guthrie-esque comedic performance. After all, here's an international celebrity who started his career pretending to be a drifter, now planted in the back of a squad car on the suspicion of vagrancy. But things take an abrupt turn. The problem, Dylan tells Gilmore, is that he cannot ever be mistaken for someone else, that someone always sees through his act and gives it away. That's the side of people I see, he snarls. People like to betray people. They want to be the one to do it. I've experienced that a lot. Gilmore hits a nerve here, and when he next asked about Dylan's unacknowledged borrowings from Civil War poet Henry Timrod on love and theft, the songwriter returns unexpectedly to that now ancient Newsweek article. "People have tried to stop me every inch of the way," he bitterly complains. "They've always had bad stuff to say about me. Newsweek magazine lit the fuse way back when. Newsweek printed that some kid from New Jersey wrote Blowin' in the Wind, that it wasn't me at all. And when that didn't fly, people accused me of stealing the melody from a 16th century Protestant hymn. And when that didn't work, they said they made a mistake and that it was really an old Negro spiritual." It's astonishing, really. Can those two narrow, yellowing columns in the back of a Newsweek magazine still be haunting him all these years later? His outlined epitaphs, the lines of Restless farewell, his insistence that songs live only in the moment, and his various attempts to bid farewell seem not to have worked. Dylan's many revenants still roam through his imagination, and he admits that they cannot be forgotten, ignored, or exorcised. 50 years later, it turns out, he still does give a damn. And this brings us to the title track for Tempest, one of his last original compositions. I have to say, I told Anne-Marie this just as we were beginning. This talk was slightly different before Dylan announced the release of a new album, because this was the last song Dylan wrote, and this was an even better point until he started writing new songs. So take it all with a grain of salt, I suppose. This song, too, was another kind of farewell, fashioned by a man in the crowded company of ghosts that have wandered through the many worlds he has fashioned. This haunted song rambles on through 14 minutes. If you haven't heard Tempest, it's an extremely long song, one of a handful of these very long songs Dylan has created. So these are so it encompasses 14 minutes of sounds, images, and characters from the past, all presided over by an enigmatic watchman who nightly dreams their doom. Like his other sprawling epics, he records an 11-minute song called Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, or its reprise, the 16-minute Highlands from Modern Times in 2006. This one, too, is built around a looping musical structure that could seemingly go on forever. But it differs in one key way from those earlier songs. It tells the story of the Titanic, and thus a tragic, predestined ending awaits from the moment it begins. Length here does not simply fill the time as the singer waits for something to happen. That's basically the theme of Highlands, a song which is kind of just about boredom and the everyday. Instead, the length of this song only delays the inevitable moment of death's victory. The song's 45 four-line stanzas unfurl without a chorus over an uptempo waltz that belies the descriptions of terror, death, and violence woven through the lyrics. Dylan wrote the song amid the frenzy of Titanic mania that marked the centenary of that maritime disaster, and it jumbles together a disparate collection of fictional and historical source material. As is so often the case in Dylan's late songs, Tempest is also laden with literary and musical references that reflect the writer's deep yet wildly disparate reading. It first quotes the Carter family's 1956 song about the disaster, itself one of the very last singles released by country music's most influential group. Dylan also invokes Shakespeare's final play. So this is the quotation here that appears in the Dylan song from the Carter family original. Dylan also invokes Shakespeare's final play, even though he limply tried to deny it, saying that the bard's work was called The Tempest, while his song was merely called Tempest. This is the play, of course, in which Shakespeare bids farewell to his audience on the shores of the last fantastical world he fashioned. Most of the songs recorded for Tempest made it quickly into Dylan's concert sets, and many of them, like Pay and Blood and Early Roman Kings, have become immediate favorites, performed at nearly every live show. The title track, however, like Restless Farewell, joins only a handful of recorded songs that Dylan has never performed live. The 1963 song, actually, that original Restless Farewell, has only been performed live twice by Dylan. Once, just after it was recorded, and then again at Frank Sinatra's 80th birthday party. And it has been covered only rarely and only by Dylan's close inner circle. Itself another oddity for a Dylan song. If we can indeed read it as Dylan's attempt to bid the folk world an angry goodbye, I suppose this makes sense. The jab it lands, after all, only stings when he can deliver it directly, then turn and walk away. It would be weird to keep saying goodbye again and again. Tempest, however, has never been covered. Indeed, has never been performed in public at all. There are, of course, sound technical reasons for this. Just remembering all those verses, after all, would be incredibly daunting. Still, if it is something like a final farewell, then it makes sense that he has no interest in performing it live, no interest in saying goodbye more than once. Like the sinking of the Titanic, this particular ending is both fated and final. Death will come to silence his voice and give the lie to the idea that he's on a never-ending tour. But is this really the end? Like Restless Farewell some 5 decades earlier, Tempest too is beset by a crucial ambiguity. In the original Carter family tune, the disaster unfolds after a careless watchman falls asleep. In Dylan's version, however, the watchman becomes a double for the songwriter, who invents the catastrophe. The watchman, he lay dreaming, Dylan sings. He dreamed the Titanic was sinking, and he tried to tell someone. The song then becomes that act of telling. Each verse is this watchman describing this disaster that he's dreaming, making each of those verses into an act of creation and destruction as Dylan engages in what becomes a fury of invention, right? Creating character after character only to sink them beneath the waves. Just as it's unclear in Restless Farewell if Dylan is firing the arrow of truth or is instead felled by it, so too in Tempest, we cannot tell if Dylan as the watchman, sinks with the ship, or instead presides over its destruction. At one point, the watchman sits at 45 degrees, at a 45-degree angle, right? That famous image of the Titanic, seemingly poised to slip beneath the waves. But in the final verse, he's safe and simply dreaming again of all the things that can be. So maybe this isn't the farewell it appears to be. After complaining to Gilmore in that Rolling Stone interview about constantly being betrayed, Dylan summons his old familiar snarl. Fuck 'em, he concludes. I'll see 'em all in their graves. That's not the voice of resignation, nor of a latter-day Prospero content to drown his book and break his staff. Indeed, it's the credo of an artist who has learned to live with his ghosts. Restless farewell mixed martyrdom with a desire to destroy a restrictive public persona, creating the optimistic belief that the past might be overcome. Blind Willie Mctell reveals the impossibility of such an escape, but it's a truth the singer himself cannot seem to bear. Finally, in Tempest, Dylan accepts and even welcomes the ghosts that have haunted him from the moment he set out to find some hard traveling too. Unlike Shakespeare's Tempest, which concludes with Prospero's gentle plea that the audience, quote, "Let your indulgence set me free," Dylan's song ends on a braver, if more bitter note. Its cascade of verses might be an attempt to literally clear the decks of his mind, but through it all, the figure of the watchman endures. A double for Dylan himself, who also returns to the dreamlike space of the stage night after night. This is a picture I actually took of one of Dylan's recent performances, and you can see he actually lights the stage in this very bare way to make it seem like he's something of a watchman up there. And he himself has described these performances as Shakespearean in their structure. He doesn't talk to the audience when he comes out. He performs a kind of 5-act play and then leaves. Up there, he's surrounded by the ghosts of his many other selves, both those that stalk him personally and the ones that each new audience member brings in with them. If you've ever been to a Dylan concert, you'll know this. Whoever's sitting around you always wants him to play whatever their favorite song happens to be. As that sudden explosion of anger about a 50-year-old Newsweek article suggests, he has decided not to make peace with the past. But neither does he hope to escape it. Instead, he faces down his ghosts, the ghosts that might crowd him out. He's content to wrestle with them up there, and perhaps wrestle with us, through one more performance. Like the watchman, he may well see them into their graves, but the songs will summon them again in a potentially endless loop. Fuck 'em, he says as he takes the stage. It's time to face the past again, and to make art from our inability to escape it. Thank you very much. Let me unshare my screen.
Well, thank you so much,
There we
go. Sean. That was a wonderful lecture, so rich, full of new ideas and full of things to dig into and to consider. It was a major experience for us to listen to your thoughts on Dylan. So thank you so much for participating here at Dias. We really hope that you will return to us next year when things are better, and we can meet in the auditorium, the wonderful new auditorium of Dias, and have a long discussion on your ideas. But thank you for this. It was a great experience for us, and thank you to all participants for being here and joining us with this Dias lecture. We hope to see you again at other lectures. Follow our program at our homepage, webpage. There's a lot of events coming and new lectures to be announced. But thank you for today. Thank you, Latham.
Of course, it's a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to do it. And you should always feel free to send me questions if you have them about this. I'd be happy to answer them by email or anything like that. So please feel free to reach out. And don't forget to learn more about the Dylan Institute here in Tulsa as well. I'd be happy to share information about that as well.
Oh, that's a great offer to us. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.